in August 61. And only 2 days after my arrival in Berlin, I realized that something was going on. Something sinister was being prepared.
That something was the Berlin Wall. When the Soviet Union erected a physical barrier between East and West, the Cold War really began.
I could have fled for the West and could have remained a free man in a civilized democratic country. But I missed the chance. There was a wall, no way for me to get out.
On either side of the wall, the intelligence battle now began, as the Cold War hotted up.
We'd probably thought of the Russians as our allies through the Second World War, from 1941 therefore to 1945. Then the Berlin blockade, the general perception was they weren't our friends after all. And then 3 years later, in 1951, this explosion of awareness that the Russian KGB, or the NKVD as it was then known, was actually spying on us.
The KGB, the CIA, MI6. Intelligence agencies comprising vast networks of agents, informants, civil servants, computers and satellites, from the high-tech to low cunning.
Imagine sending a letter to West Berlin. Meanwhile, the person who lives there, he's a KGB informer. He takes the letter without opening it, takes it to East Berlin, meeting a KGB officer, and passes it on to him. The officer passes on the letter to Moscow. And first in Moscow, it's opened, and a special solution is applied to the letter, and the secret writing would appear there.
In the early days, you became a spy by invitation only. Absolute loyalty to the establishment was demanded and expected. And where else to go for fine, upstanding young men and women?
I got on to the Cambridge Careers Service and asked them what they thought I ought to do. And the man there came up with the idea of my becoming a spy.
Enter the class conspiracy theory. By handpicking the young elite for intelligence service jobs, the establishment made sure it stayed in control.
God bless the squire and his relations and keep us in our proper stations. Class is the basis of the intelligence service definition of loyalty.
You had to place in order of social precedence Earl, Duke, Marquis, Baron and Viscount. And I think it was one of the very few questions that I got right.
We were issued with an extraordinary book about protocol, which said, you know, if you're getting into the Rolls-Royce with your ambassador, go round and get in on the door on the other side. Do not crawl across his knees into the far seat.
Most people in MI6 are middle class, white, studied at Oxford, Cambridge Public School.
And quite right too, because the people who went to Oxbridge had to pass an extra exam. By and large, they were the cream, the intellectual elite of the country, and so they are the people who one would want in one's intelligence services.
But not everyone agrees you have to be posh to be a spy.
They have to be highly intelligent people of good character, but if you're asking do they come from a particular social background, no, that certainly isn't true.
But even in the Soviet Union, spying was regarded as an elite job.
In their own society, the KGB officers were the cream of the cream. They were immensely privileged people. You'd have thought they'd be the last to turn on their own regime.
But turn some of them did. On either side, the ultimate prize was to find a spy willing to betray his own country.
We read then, as we don't anymore, of suddenly the arrest of a Defense Department official or a diplomat or something arrested on charges of espionage and therefore treason.
From the first meeting in a safe apartment, I started to cooperate very, very well, actually, very intensely and gladly, happily with the British intelligence.
Perhaps the point of all this secret wheeling and dealing was to avoid the absolute calamity of a nuclear war.
Really, the only way that Russia could have won the Cold War was by making it into a hot war, and it was to avoid that so much espionage went on, and counter-espionage and disinformation and misinformation and all the black arts of the espionage trade.
In other words, the spreading of rumours, lies and conspiracy theories about the enemy.
To some extent, the Cold War was fueled by exaggeration and deliberate fabrication on both sides.
I don't think the West created conspiracy theories in order to retaliate against the Soviet Union. What happened was that the KGB was always involved in spreading this disinformatia. They call it disinformation.
The KGB would develop a number of contacts in the media, journalists, editors, members of the parliament, and would, speaking to them, influencing them, talking to them, would make them publish something which was useful for Moscow.
People invented stuff. I mean, the British government had a whole department called IRD, whose job was largely to invent and exaggerate and propagate stories about the Red Menace. If you listen to IRD, Britain was on the edge of a communist revolution from 1952 onwards.
Then anyone who was a socialist was described as an agent of the Kremlin, working for the KGB and so on. That was the political line, and I think you have to look at it like that.
Well, they were an evil empire. They, in fact, were operating conspiracies against the West.
The biggest one of all, of course, was the planting of missiles in Cuba. That was a conspiracy, and it was exposed, and it led to a crisis.
The Russians were conspiring with the Cubans. They claimed to be deploying only defensive weapons in Cuba, while actually positioning offensive missiles within striking distance of the United States. It brought the world close to nuclear war. The conspiracy was blown apart by Soviet Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who worked for both MI6 and the CIA. He told the West the Soviets were bluffing because their missiles were not yet operational.
The information that he provided to Britain and the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis about what was going on in the Soviet Union and what real Soviet capabilities were like was absolutely invaluable.
On the strength of this information, President Kennedy issued an ultimatum: back off or we attack you. The Soviets backed off. That was the height of Cold War paranoia. So did we really have anything to be scared of?
There was actually a serious struggle going on between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, but a large chunk of it was simple.
The British establishment decided that in order to fight off socialist ideas, they would pretend there was a military threat. There was no military threat at all.
I don't think that the Red Menace was entirely made up, in that there were tanks, divisions of tanks, kept in East Germany in total readiness for an invasion.
The Russian army couldn't even beat Chechnya. How could they have defeated the whole armed force of NATO?
They printed up the medals that were going to be given for the invasion of the West, and it could have been unleashed at any moment.
We were dealing with some very dangerous people at the time, and nobody should forget that now.
In 1981, a new dimension was added to the arms race when Ronald Reagan entered the White House.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
He had made his views about communism very clear some years earlier.
My name is Ronald Reagan. Last year, the contributions of 16 million Americans to the crusade for freedom made possible the World Freedom Bell, symbol of hope and freedom to the communist-dominated peoples of Eastern Europe, and built this powerful 135,000-watt Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay, Crusade for Freedom, Empire State Building, New York City.
With the similarly hawkish Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street, together they presented a staunch anti-communist face to the East. Reagan spent massively on defense and talked up the Soviet threat.
As the Reagan military build-up continued, Gordievsky did report serious paranoia on the Soviet side.
I passed on the information about the Soviet leadership being worried that the West, the United States, were preparing a sudden nuclear attack on the Soviet Union outside context of a conflict, which was a total paranoia.
Ironically, it was this escalation of the Cold War which finally seems to have brought it to an end. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, sworn in 1985, faced a crumbling domestic economy. Food shortages were getting worse, and he had neither the will nor the money to continue competing in the arms race.
They began to understand that they simply could not match US and Western technology, and that this was going to change the balance of the military balance against them. And that caused paranoia. It also caused them, in the end, I think one of the factors that caused them to decide that it simply wasn't worth continuing the Cold War.
24 hours ago, the people of East Berlin broke through the walls of their prison with the apparent blessing of those who'd been their jailers.
When the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November 1989, the old Soviet Union collapsed with it. The world of spying would never be the same again.
When the Cold War ended, the sort of need for this great apparatus to protect us from a Russian invasion, when the BBC would have to broadcast Lenin every day instead of the prayer for the day, when that disappeared, they didn't know what to do and their jobs were at stake.
I don't think that spying has stopped by any means since the end of the Cold War. It's just that it's lost its life and death sense of a Manichaean struggle between good and evil.
So what were the intelligence services to do now the old Red Menace had been dismantled?
We essentially slew this dragon, and now we find ourselves in a jungle full of a large number of poisonous snakes, and the snakes are harder to keep track of than the dragon was.
The emphasis has shifted, but their work is every bit as important as it ever was. In particular, the focus on terrorist activities. And the activities of rogue states.
We have Saddam Hussein in Iraq, we have Gaddafi in Libya. We can't rely on just public newspapers and television programs to find out what is happening in these countries.
Now the spies are keeping tabs on tens, if not hundreds, of smaller regimes. It's harder to keep track of what they're up to. In Britain, this has prompted a chorus of allegations suggesting they're not properly accountable.
There had been stories, events over the years, suggestions that the intelligence security agencies were out of control, that they were sort of running private enterprise activities, and that there should be a greater measure of accountability.
Accountability doesn't mean that secrets have to be exposed. It's still perfectly possible to maintain secrecy of operational details, but you need to have accountability of the management to stop mistakes and cock-ups being made.
And when they do get things wrong, we have an absolute right to know about that because we're paying their wages, in the same way as we have an absolute right to criticise the government, and we have a right for papers to report when the government gets things wrong.
So in 1994, to keep an eye on its own agents, the government set up the Intelligence and Security Committee.
Other government departments have a select committee of parliamentarians who oversee them, that we'd have a committee of parliamentarians that would oversee the intelligence and security agencies, and that's what we do.
But how well do you do it?
The politicians are only shown things by the intelligence and security services which the intelligence and security services want them to see. Thus their view is extraordinarily limited.
The difficulty often is to know what to ask for when you don't know what you're looking for, and that's a challenge that any committee faces.
At least in one respect, we do now know where to look.
The building they operate from, which in the past was unknown to most people in Britain, but the Russians knew perfectly well where it was, well, you know, why maintain the pretense of secrecy in an issue of that kind? So now we have a marvellous building not very far from here, which the whole of London knows exactly what its role is.
That building is two fingers to the rest of the British political and Whitehall system, because that is a huge monument to their vanity and their glory.
They've also taken to advertising for recruits in The Guardian, but even this hasn't silenced the critics.
Yes, they have adverts in the papers now, they recruit translators openly, they recruit personnel openly, but that doesn't mean that they are themselves accountable.
I think it's just a sheer appearance of transparency. Because they advertise in The Guardian for spies, doesn't necessarily mean that the people who finally are chosen have come because they've answered the adverts in The Guardian so much as gone about it the old way, like I was recruited by a gentleman whispering in my ear about a certain department of the Foreign Office.
It wouldn't be a secret service if it didn't have secrets. And to protect those secrets, there's this, the Official Secrets Act.
You have to, in the final analysis, to have some way of protecting what are essential, vital national secrets that are crucial to the security of our country.
So if you work for the security services, you sign the Official Secrets Act. And to talk about that work later puts you in breach of that act and subject to stiff penalties.
They can only take that risk on the basis that they may go to prison if they're convicted.
But spies do occasionally speak out.
A former MI6 officer has been jailed for 12 months under the Official Secrets Act. Richard Tomlinson admitted last month that he'd approached a publisher about writing a book on his experiences in the Secret Intelligence Service.
The government is facing potential embarrassment over the voluntary return of David Shaler, the former MI5 officer who made a number of allegations, including that MI6 was involved in a plot to assassinate Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, was today immediately arrested, charged under the Official Secrets Act and bailed.
Recent whistleblowers like Richard Tomlinson and David Shaler have stoked the conspiracy theories by alleging that the Official Secrets Act is a screen behind which the intelligence service can hide illegal activities. Both men insist they have a right to at least make their claims without facing prosecution.
MI6 will always maintain this great mystique about how they have to have utter secrecy otherwise it endangers the lives of their agents. Well, you know, this is a great exaggeration, frankly.
We have to give whistleblowers the benefit of the doubt because it's too dangerous not to. If they're talking bullshit, that's fine. An inquiry will establish they're talking bullshit and it can all be over and done with. But to just ignore them is too great a hostage to fortune, it really is.
The whistleblowers allege the secret services can choose to operate outside the law. David Shaler's allegation is they've done just that, in getting involved in a planned assassination attempt on Colonel Gaddafi.
If they were plotting to kill Gaddafi, well, jolly good thing too. That's what intelligence services is all about, I would have thought.
Foreign powers, big business, such high-profile connections are what we expect of the secret services. But the reality is their bread and butter work is far more mundane. It involves a vast amount of spying on the everyday activities of ordinary people. The old Big Brother conspiracy theory still exists, but the equipment they're now using is a lot more high-tech.
Spying from satellites in the sky on people, from listening to their communication, intercepting their phone taps, or their mail, or their email nowadays, or their faxes, or whatever. This is, I would have thought, probably 90% of information gathering today.
The security services have always eavesdropped, but are they listening now to absolutely everybody?
They intercepted my phone when I was a cabinet minister because I went and asked the Prime Minister about it, Jim Callaghan. Oh, he said they're not, and so on, but I didn't think he knew. But I never made a lot of it because at the time, if you talked about it, they said you're paranoid. Now if I say I'm bugged, they say, oh, of course, everybody's bugged.
Somebody said to me, I don't mind if my phone's tapped. I have nothing to hide. I mind very much, actually, if I think my phone's tapped or my emails are being intercepted because it's such an infringement of civil liberties.
Some believe that the slightest hint of anti-establishment dissent will provoke the interest of the secret services.
Anyone who's politically active, even locally, they'll open a file on them. If somebody writes a lot of letters about the rights of ramblers or the need for parking spaces, the security service say that person might cause trouble. Let's just open a file on them.
But there are bigger fish to fry. Listening stations which allow eavesdropping on you and me also make it possible to spy on other countries. One part of an advanced listening system called Echelon, thought to be owned and operated by the Americans, is allegedly based here near Harrogate in Yorkshire.
It's RAF Menwith Hill, apparently. It is not. It is run by the National Security Agency of America.
Echelon is the system which is believed, though it's never been confirmed, to be operating whereby the Americans are able to hoover up millions of electronic communications per minute and use that for whatever purposes they deem fit.
Everything that's radiated is collected by Echelon. Everything.
Any airborne communications.
Data transmissions.
Faxes.
ATM transactions.
Telephone tapping.
Baby monitors.
Emails.
Echelon literally intercepts every radio signal that is transmitted worldwide.
The logic is simple. If you can eavesdrop on your competitors' conversations, negotiations, business deals, you can be one step ahead of them. It's called economic espionage. Recently, the French have alleged the British and Americans are colluding against them, doing precisely this.
The only thing I'll say is that Britain and the United States historically have done a great deal of intelligence cooperation.
We have people working in each other's headquarters, as is well known, and intelligence is jointly gathered and it is shared.
But does this amount to conspiracy against our European allies?
We don't spy on, for example, continental European countries in order to learn their technology so we can give it to American companies. I mean, just to be blunt about it, there's not all that much there that we would want to steal if we were inclined to steal it.
The French are staggeringly hypocritical about this. They spy on us just as much as we might or might not spy on them.
When there is a long history and a proven history of intelligence gathering by the French for business and economic and commercial purposes, and they're quite open and unashamed about it. They regard it as a patriotic national duty in the interests of La France to get as much information as they can.
Whatever the truth of the matter, it's been taken seriously enough in Europe that an EU investigation has begun into France's allegations. Economic espionage is clearly a serious business, but exposing or trying to expose Secret Service activities can be far more deadly.
In the former Soviet Union, they would give such a person a death sentence, and then in a few weeks' time after, shoot them.
People are got rid of, but not disposed of physically. They don't take them in a plane and drop them in the Irish Sea.
Oh, if somebody offends the security services, they have a lot of ways of dealing with them.
David Shaler escaped to Paris when he went public with his allegations, but he still managed to make the occasional television appearance in Britain.
Did you sign the official Secrets Act? It's just a piece of paper to you, isn't it?
That somebody's sweeping up. I signed the same document that people who sweep up in defence contractors sign.
And they at least respect it.
Having moved repeatedly, Richard Tomlinson's latest home is Venice.
British intelligence have used their influence with intelligence services around the world to have me thrown out of most of the other countries I've lived in.
Frankly, Richard Tomlinson got away lightly. It wasn't so very long ago that we used to hang traitors.
When you join the intelligence services, you sign the Official Secrets Act. And if you want to sign it and then spill all the beans, or your version of the beans, you should expect to face some consequences, yes.
So, can the intelligence services ever hope to escape the accusations of conspiracy theorists?
Spying attracts nutters almost automatically. It just is a magnet for conspiracy theorists and for people who always like to feel that they know the truth.
They have very little confidence in an intelligence agency that told everyone what it was up to. So of course they're silent. They're supposed to be silent. They're not doing their job when they blab.
That is not to say we should not be pushing at the bounds to make sure we have as much information as possible in terms of democratic accountability.
Conspiracy is a very special word which implies either something illegal or something improper. Of course the agencies need to work very closely together in many areas. They need to be efficient, but they do that under the law.
Yes, it's a conspiracy, or a vast number of conspiracies. Of course, their defenders would say it's a conspiracy in the interests of Britain PLC, wouldn't they?
I don't believe in the conspiracy theory. I think it's a great mistake. And if you talk in language that implies it, people write you off, oh, he's a nutter, he's just always talking about a conspiracy. Whereas if you have an argument that they can't answer, they have to listen.